Okay, here we are at the train station at Córdoba. It's a beautiful station, like the one in Seville, Santa Justa. It is a modern station built for 1992 when they had all the activities going on in Spain. Okay, we got up very early this morning, took a long train ride. Now we're here in Córdoba. We're gonna walk around and see the sights, but we're not doing anything until we have some good hot coffee and some sugary treats. So we don't want to go to just any cafeteria. We want to go to the best and oldest and most typical Córdoba cafeteria, the Café San Francisco. Okay, we're walking through the streets of Córdoba on our way to the Roman Bridge. Okay, welcome to Córdoba. Córdoba really is one of the most historic cities in all of Spain. In fact, Córdoba has more historic World Heritage Sites with UNESCO than any city in the world. It was founded by the Romans. There's Bronze Age remains in the area, but the city of Córdoba was a Roman city, and we could see here the great Roman bridge. Legend here has it that was built by Julius Caesar, the end of the 1st century BC. That's not exactly true. He was here. He was waging a civil war against the son of Pompeo, and Pompeo and his troops controlled Córdoba. Córdoba was faithful to that side of the Civil War, and the people in Seville were faithful to Julius Caesar. And he came here determined to stamp out the resistance in Córdoba. They had a bridge back then, which is actually sort of like barges, and Julius Caesar set up here, and he created not exactly a bridge, but a big pile of rocks. And then the engineers diverted the course of the river to try to leave Pompeo's troops high and dry, and so they could attack Córdoba. Well, actually, then there was a decisive battle, and Julius Caesar won. And with that victory, he became the dictator of all the Roman holdings and the first Roman emperor. The bridge itself was built slightly later in Augustus Caesar's time, 1st century AD. This would actually be part of the Via Augusta, a great road that went all the way from Cadiz, the west coast of Spain, to Rome. It's 331 meters. There's 16 arches. It once had 17 arches. Now, the Romans really built things to last. They thought the Roman Empire was going to last forever, and that's how they built their roads and bridges. In fact, this bridge, up until the 90s, was being used daily by trucks and cars and everything, buses. Now it's been remodeled and made into a pedestrian monument that you can walk across, but it's just as strong as ever. It has had some reformations. Only arches Number 14 and 15 from the gateway are original Roman, never been restored. For many centuries, this was the only bridge on the Guadalquivir River. Other bridges were simply barges. Okay, let's take a walk across the bridge. This statue here is the Triumph of San Rafael. It's one of 11 similar monuments here in Córdoba. It represents Saint Raphael, the archangel, who cured the blindness of Tobias using a fish. And he's often portrayed with the fish. Sometimes he's portrayed with the horn, heralding the Last Judgment. But as patron saint of Córdoba, he's a very revered figure here in Córdoba. It's a 17th century Baroque statue in stone by Barnabé Gómez del Rio. Okay, this is the Torre de la Calahorra. It's on the south side of the bridge. It's actually not Roman. Its origins are Islamic, and it was a defensive tower to guard the entrance of Córdoba from across the river. The first tower was originally built by Henry II, in a civil war in Castile between Pedro I and Enrique II. Okay, the first tower was a smaller rectangular square tower. Then the second tower was added, Henry II, in 14th century. And you can see the coat of arms of Castile up there. And then later, in Renaissance times, with the invention of gunpowder, they needed a stronger fortification. And they built this round tower uniting the two smaller square towers. And they've got embrasures, which are basically windows to shoot out of. And they added this barbicane, which is an exterior defensive structure with castellations and a moat to make the tower safer and defend the bridge more effectively. Córdoba has the accent on the first O, Córdoba in Spanish. It's the capital of the province of Córdoba, part of Andalusia, one of 8 provinces in Andalusia. It's 1,253 square kilometers, and 326,000 people live here, approximately, making it the 3rd largest city in Andalusia after Sevilla and Malaga. Córdoba is a pretty authentic Andalusian city, a sun-drenched, hot place in the summer. It is a sort of a basin, sometimes called the frying pan, a flat depression in the Guadalquivir Valley, south of the Sierra Morena mountain range. The Guadalquivir is the same river that runs through Sevilla. Guadalquivir means big river in Arabic. Córdoba was Roman, then it was a Visigoth city, but its greatest splendor was in Islamic times, the 8th century to the 11th century. Córdoba is known for its exotic Islamic spirit, and it's known for flamenco music, bullfighters, silversmiths, poets and philosophers and artists, and fine gastronomy and wine. There's actually a small nature preserve here, the Sotos de Albolafia. It's got these beautiful cottonwood trees and little waterfalls. It's the Guadalquivir River, and there's over 120 bird species here, things like herons and egrets and ducks and geese and bitterns and swallows and jackdaws and crows. And there's even some interesting mammals, like it's not unusual to see otters here, the playful otters. Okay, there's 4 interesting old structures here downstream of the Roman bridge, and they are mills, originally from Islamic times, and they were remodeled and renovated over the centuries. This one, the Mill of San Antonio, it pumped water to the Alcázar Royal Palace of Córdoba. And then it was converted into a wheat mill to grind up wheat until the 15th century when Ferdinand and Isabel lived in the royal palace. And Isabel didn't like the noise, so she had the whole thing dismantled. Fortunately, it's been reassembled, and the people of Córdoba are so impressed with their mill. They love the mill so much that it's actually on the coat of arms of Córdoba. Okay, the first thing we find when we cross the bridge entering Córdoba is this triumphal 16th century gateway. There was a Roman gateway, and then there was an Islamic gateway, or Bab, but in Renaissance time, they built this magnificent structure with Doric columns and medallions of the coats of arms of Spain to commemorate the visit of Philip II to Córdoba. So that's the gate of the bridge, 16th century Renaissance, and that is by Hernán Ruiz III, the architect, son of Hernán Ruiz II, famous architect here in Córdoba, who also built the Campanario and other structures in Seville. This beautiful monument is another triunfo, a triumph of San Rafael, Saint Raphael, the archangel. This is the most spectacular and largest of all the triumphant monuments of Saint Raphael in Córdoba. In the 17th century, Córdoba suffered a terrible plague, and many people believe that Saint Raphael helped Padre Andrés de Roales in saving the city. Okay, let's take a really good look inside and out at Córdoba's most important, most spectacular attraction, the Mosque of Córdoba. We talked about the Muslim invasion of Spain. In 711 AD, Muslim invaders led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from North Africa to southern Spain. Soon they conquered a great deal of Spain, defeating the Visigoths. Islamic Spain would become known as Al-Andalus, where we get the name Andalusia. A few years later, Abd al-Rahman Abderrahman I, came to Córdoba and founded the Emirate of Córdoba. Abderrahman was an Umayyad prince from Damascus, today Syria, but his family had dangerous enemies in the rival group of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasids tricked the Umayyad into a false truce and a banquet, only to massacre 80 members of the ruling Umayyad family. Young Abderrahman managed to escape. As a sole survivor, he traveled incognito for a long time from place to place in exile with a small band of faithful servants. Eventually, in 755, he crossed over to Al-Andalus, Spain, where there were many sympathetic to the cause of the Umayyads. He set himself up in Córdoba, where he became a ruler, Emirate of Córdoba, and the first king in what is now known as the Umayyad dynasty. Abderrahman I was considered a good leader. He conquered territories east of the Ebro River. He expanded the influence of Islam throughout the Iberian Peninsula. He ruled a diverse kingdom that not only included Muslims, but also Christians and Jews. He started the Umayyad dynasty, and the thing to be remembered the most was he founded the Mosque of Córdoba. Bear in mind that the rest of Europe was barely emerging from the Dark Ages. All of the engineering and science and technology of the Romans, mathematics, astronomy, and science of the Greeks had been greatly ignored and forgotten for centuries. While the rest of Europe was in the Dark Ages, the culture of the Umayyad was flourishing. The citizens of Al-Andalus were much more literate and educated than other parts of the world. This really was a golden age for Córdoba. Córdoba would have libraries, doctors, spectacular architecture, and it really was the jewel of Europe at that time. Abderrahman chose an existing 6th century Visigoth church, the Basilica of San Vicente. They appropriated or used materials that were already there in that church to create the original mosque. Things like capitals, columns, marble pieces. The original mosque had 11 naves and was oriented north and south. Some say Abderrahman I oriented the mosque towards Damascus and not towards Mecca, which was to cause a great uproar in medieval Islam. But it's most likely the orientation was due to the previous foundation of the Basilica of San Vicente, and it was parallel to the river. San Vicente itself had been built on a Roman temple. Here is a map showing the various parts of the mosque. We've got the first section in orange where it says Mezquita Primitiva. That was Abderrahman, the first section. The next part was to the south. That's the first edition by his great-grandson, Abderrahman II, 9th century AD. Then that was added on to later by the descendant Al-Hakam II in the 10th century. This is really considered the high point of the Umayyad dynasty, artistically and culturally. Finally, the mosque was added onto, this time to the east, by Al-Mansur, and that was the largest addition. But the story doesn't stop there. In the 15th and 16th century, parts of the mosque were demolished and a Christian cathedral was built right in the middle of the mosque. Something like a yolk in the middle of the egg. It gets a lot of criticism, and even the King of Spain at the time, Charles V, who originally sponsored the cathedral, when he saw that they were destroying parts of the mosque, he said something like, "We have destroyed something unique to make something ordinary." And he ordered that all construction on the cathedral stop, even going so far as imposing the death penalty on anybody destroying parts of the mosque. That pretty much conserved the mosque. Now, defenders of the cathedral say that by making it into a church for centuries, the mosque has maintained and preserved and cared for, in spite of the alteration in the middle. So let's take a look at the outside of the mosque first. We're going to take a walk all the way around. Okay, now in Islamic architecture, usually the exterior of the buildings were not overly decorative. That was considered presumptuous, and it was more common that the interior is where the most lavish decoration is. Having said that, there is some very beautiful decoration on the exterior of this mosque. We're going to take a look at all the doorways around the mosque. The first one is the doorway of the Sabbat, and that was the entrance for the royalty, the royal family, because the Alcázar royal palace is very near here. That was their own private entrance to the mosque. Okay, the next one is the doorway of San Ildefonso. Now they've all been renamed with Christian names because inside the mosque now, around the outside of the walls, the outside of the interior, are Christian chapels. So the doorways tend to have the name of the corresponding Christian chapel. If we look at this doorway, we can see some absolutely spectacular Islamic decorations. That horseshoe arch, the perfectly round horseshoe arch, is called the Caliphatal arch. It's a type of Islamic architecture, very common. And then we've got these multifoil arches, the ones with little lobes that go around. And we've got the alternating red brick, white stone design, which we'll see inside the mosque again and again. And at the top, we've got cedar of Lebanon castellations. They look like cedar trees. That door is also called the door of Al-Hakam II because it was built in his time period, and it corresponds to his addition to the mosque. This one's called the Puerta del Postigo, the door of the Postigo. Yeah, it was greatly changed in the 15th century. You can see it's not entirely Islamic. It has this Gothic ornamentation also. Once again, a very beautiful bronze doorway. And that window has a simple iron grate. And that window has the Islamic lattice work. Here's the doorway of San Miguel, once again named after the chapel that it leads to. It's Islamic with the arabesque designs, sort of a vegetable relief design. And it has the Christian edition of a coat of arms of an archbishop. This is the Puerta de San Esteban, the doorway of St. Stephen. Apparently it really was the doorway of St. Stephen, engraved on the ground. That engraving refers to the hospital, San Sebastian, that's right in front. This was the entrance to the oratory of the original mosque in Abderrahman I time, 8th century AD. Remodeled in the 9th century when the decoration was added. And there's even an inscription which testifies to this. This is the entrance to the Patio de Naranjos, the orange tree patio, the patio of absolutions. That's the entrance to the mosque itself. Got a blind horseshoe arch with the small overhanging roof. Here's a little Gothic doorway, Postigo de Leche, the doorway of the milk. And that's because in the Middle Ages, poor people could come here and children and get charity and get free milk. This is a little cistern, a small well where people used to come get running water. This is the Puerta del Perdón. It's next to the bell tower. 14th century Mudéjar. Originally was a 10th century Islamic doorway. Heavily restored in the 18th century. It has a spectacular wooden door sealed in bronze, but we can't appreciate too much because it's under restoration now. It was called the doorway of pardon because this is where bishops would pardon those who did not pay their church dues, but they had to kiss a stone cross inside that door. This little doorway is easy to miss. It was actually discovered in 1929 during some sort of renovation. It seems awfully low because the ground level has actually risen over the centuries. It's part of Abderrahman I's original mosque wall, and that was the ladies' entrance to the mosque. Here's an 18th century neoclassical doorway, Caño Gordo, and it's next to this pretty little blue fountain, blue marble fountain. Let's take a look at this altar here. It's beloved here in Córdoba. This is the altar of the Virgin of the Farolas. And farolas are lamps, and it's obviously called that because there's these lamps here. It's a painting in an altar with 4 little marble columns. That painting is attributed to Julio Romero de Torres. The truth is, the original painting is in the Julio Romero de Torres Museum here in Córdoba. This is actually a copy by his own son, Rafael Romero. And it's a typical Julio Romero de Torres image. His specialty were dark-eyed brunettes, which typical women of Córdoba had long dark hair and big dark eyes, and he made his career painting Las Morenas de Córdoba, the beautiful dark-haired ladies. In this case, Mary. There's a little oval-shaped plaque with a noteworthy poem. Si quieres que tu dolor se convierte en alegría, no pasarás pecador sin alabar a María. Something like, if you want your pain to become happiness, don't pass, you sinner, without praising Mary. This is the Puerta de la Grada Redonda. It's kind of an unusual style, chiriguesco, which is late Baroque style with lots of curvy linear designs and curly cues. Chiriguesco. Here on the east side of the patio, we've got a Renaissance remodeling of the original Islamic doors. This is 16th century Renaissance by Hernán Ruiz II. Once again, Hernán Ruiz II was from Córdoba. He built the campanario of the Giralda in Seville. We look up here, we see archbishops' coats of arms. There's two other shields that have drawing reliefs of the Puerta del Perdón and also the old mosque tower, the Alminar, before it was changed to the one we see today. And up above, there's a curved gable with the image of the Eternal Father. It also says, Hernán Ruiz Young, year 1573, but he actually died in 1569, so they think that's kind of a mistake. There's some more doorways on the east side. The Puerta de San Juan, the gate of St. John, goes to the chapel of St. John the Baptist on the interior of the mosque. It's similar but different to the doorways we saw on the west. Here we don't have the interlaced design. They're more round horseshoe arches. The next one, Puerta de Baptisterio, goes to baptismal chapel. Different types of arches, inscriptions in stone. The guy who restored this, Velázquez Bosco, a famous architect, was very rigorous in his authenticity. And here's one exception to his code of not changing anything. He wrote an inscription in the time of the Sultan Alfonso, hijo, son of Alfonso, early 20th century, referring to Alfonso XII, king of Spain, as if he were a sultan. Here's a recently restored Puerta de la Concepción Antigua of the antique Conception, and we can really appreciate the beautiful arabesque designs, which is that floral leaf-like design in the stonework. And these are much more deteriorated. The door of the Sagrario, the door of the sanctuary, it's heavily eroded. The passage of time has not been kind to this door. This is the south wall on the calle Corregidor Luis de Cerda. It's the only wall with no doorways. Here's a balcony with red jasper altarpiece under split gable. Corresponds to the tabernacle inside. This is where many Semana Santa Holy Week processions stop and do penitence during the week of Easter. Here's a 16th century plateresque balcony. The main thing we noticed on this south wall are these triple arches superimposed, blind arches with big mural paintings. Those were there to let light into an old library, which was once placed in that part of the old mosque after it was actually a mosque in Christian times. We're in the Patio de Naranjos, the patio, the courtyard of orange trees. It's named that, obviously, because it's absolutely filled with orange trees. In the 19th century, they planted 98 orange trees here, but apparently they were already here as early as the 16th century. And in Islamic times, this was the patio of ablutions, where the faithful would wash their hands and feet before entering the mosque. This patio is the oldest and largest in a city that's famous for patios, Córdoba. In the center is a big Baroque fountain, Fuente de Santa Maria, also called the Fuente del Olivo, the fountain of the olive, because of this hundreds of year old olive tree next to the fountain. There's also beautiful tall cypress trees and palm trees here in the patio. And after Ferdinand III conquered Cordoba in 1236, this area was actually used as a cemetery. Okay, photo opportunity. If you want a good picture of the bell tower of the Cathedral of Cordoba, we've got a nice view right here. Now, in Abderrahman III's time, 10th century AD, he rebuilt the Al-Minar, or minaret tower. And Al-Minar is where the Imam would call the faithful to pray 5 times a day from a really tall tower. Well, that Al-Minar, that minaret, is still within this tower. But in the 16th century, Hernán Ruiz II, famous architect from Cordoba, who worked in Seville, redesigned it and essentially encased the minaret tower with this stone Renaissance tower. The mosque was started by Abderrahman I in 785, reutilizing an existing Visigoth Christian church from the 6th century AD, the Basilica of San Vicente. The mosque would be enlarged 3 times over the centuries to become 23,400 square meters, making it the largest mosque in the world after Mecca, and later to be surpassed by the Blue Mosque of Istanbul. It held up to 20,000 people. If we look at a map of different phases of construction of the mosque and the cathedral, we see that now we are in the original mosque, the first part to be built by Abderrahman I in 8th century AD. It's very interesting to take a close look at the columns and capitals. These were Visigoth in origin, some even going back to Roman times. These were appropriated from the existing church, the Basilica of San Vicente, which was made by the Visigoths. And it's very unique to see something like this in an Islamic mosque, because we see figurative elements. Figurative art, which is the representation of humans or animals, is forbidden in the strictest interpretations of the Quran, the holy book of Muslim faith. And so it's not common to see figurative art in Islamic art and architecture. However, it's said that the Muslims here in Cordoba in the Umayyad dynasty were tolerant, and there were Jews and Christians living in these cities like Cordoba, and they didn't observe all of these restrictions as rigorously
as in other parts of Islam. So, in the middle of a Muslim mosque, we can see examples of figurative representation, unique aspects like these funny little people and faces carved in stone up above the capitals. Now, the Visigoths, if we look at these capitals, were influenced by the Romans, but their work was much more crude and awkward. They were not considered good artists, good artisans, and they really struggled with the capitals. They're not as graceful and not as natural and beautifully carved as you might imagine a Greek or Roman capital would be. But they've got a certain character. If we look down here in the floor, beneath us, we can see a mosaic floor of Roman influence. That's a Visigoth mosaic from the original structure, that church of San Vicente. Okay, let's go south now, and we'll pass into the next edition. Córdoba had grown, and they needed a larger mosque. So Abderrahman II built the first addition to the mosque from 833 to 855. The Qibla, which is the wall facing Mecca, was demolished in Abderrahman I's mosque, and a new Qibla was built on the south. 8 more rows were added, and new capitals are added. We no longer see the Visigoth capitals. Now, let's take a look at what is called the Old Cathedral, the Antique Cathedral. See, this is not the same. It's Christian. This is the Capilla Real, the Royal Chapel, the Capilla Via Viciosa, and the primitive main chapel. 3 chapels together in one large nave. It's sort of a Christian church built after the mosque, within the mosque. Let me explain. In 1236, Ferdinand III, King of Castile, conquered Córdoba, and he made the mosque into a Christian church, but they didn't really remodel much at that time. Maybe they built a few small chapels around the sides, and they buried a few nobles in tombs. Well, later, under the reign of King Henry II of Trastamara, he said they could build a Gothic chapel here if they didn't damage what he called the prayer room of the Moors, which is the main mihrab, which we'll see later. And so in late 15th century, 1489, Bishop Don Ignago Manrique opened 5 naves in this mosque, and they built this Gothic vaulted nave here. Okay, now we continue south, and we're going to see the real high point of the construction of the Mosque of Córdoba, the addition of Al-Hakam II, 961 through 966 AD, 10th century AD. It's a very artistic time for Córdoba. Culture was flourishing. Art, science, literature, music, and the Caliphate of Córdoba was very strong. They were quite possibly the most advanced kingdom in the world at this time. And this section of the mosque is the most spectacular. The very second day of his reign, Al-Hakam II got to work on building his own addition to the mosque. They tore down the Qibla, the wall that faced south, that faces Mecca, They demolished the existing Qibla and they built 12 more rows of columns. And they're beautiful marble columns, alternating red and blue. The capitals of these columns are an abstraction of the Corinthian capital, the old classical Greek and Roman capitals. This capital we see here has sort of hornet's nest design, and that's called the Caliphatal capital. And the word Khalifa or Caliphate is empire in Arabic. And Abderrahman I created the Emirate of Córdoba, and later Abderrahman III declared the Caliphate of Córdoba, an empire which ruled all of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, and they had holdings in North Africa, and they were very powerful in the Mediterranean and international politics. It was a very high point for Cordoba. Now let's look at the most spectacular and ornate and decorative part of the mosque, the mihrab. It is a decorative space within the Qibla wall, which is oriented to Mecca. Now, some people pointed out that it was actually pointed south. It didn't really point to Mecca, which is more southeast. And that's because of the original orientation of the foundation of the Church of San Vicente. The additions were placed immediately south, and the orientation of the mosque always remained a rectangle facing south because of the orientation of the Guadalquivir River. And this caused some problems with real fundamentalists in Arabia and other parts of Islam, but it was basically facing towards Mecca. And the mihrab is a spectacular seven-sided shape with a zocalo or ceramic skirting board near the floor. It has a very ornate system of interlacing arches, multifoil arches, which are sort of a stylization of the trees of life. It's a very sophisticated system for bearing weight, and it creates a sort of illusion of weightlessness. The dome up above is a massive, solid, extremely heavy dome. All that weight is transferred through this graceful series of interlacing arches into narrow columns to the ground, and this is a real beautiful invention of the Caliphatal architects, this system of interlaced multifoil arches. Now, the Caliphate of Cordoba was very, very strong and very powerful, and they actually had allies with the Christian empire of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. And very important allegiance they had with what today is Istanbul. And there was the Holy Roman Emperor at that time. And so the Byzantine Emperor sent artisans and boatloads of material, and this mosaic design that we see on the walls here was actually created by Byzantine artisans. It's a mosaic, a very complicated mosaic filled with gold, precious stones, semi-precious stones, and glass and ceramic. There was a masura next to the mihrab for the caliphate ruler and his family. The mihrab is the point from which prayers were led by the imam. Since the mosque is a cathedral today, it is no longer used as a mosque. Let's enjoy looking at the spectacular dome and interlacing arches and rich Byzantine mosaic decoration for a while. Okay, we're going to keep moving now. We are entering a Christian edition. This first chapel, after the mihrab, is the chapel of Cardinal Salazar. It's a 16th century addition to the mosque. He was an archbishop who wanted this sacristy to be his own mausoleum. It was built by architect Francisco Hurtada Izquierda. It's an octagonal chapel with a beautiful red marble skirting board. There's a large silver custody by Juan de Arfe. It's made out of gold and silver. And that goes out as a sort of processional float during the celebrations of Corpus Christi. It's a big deal here in Córdoba. And there's a big oil painting of San Fernando conquering Córdoba. It's kind of quirky, this painting. You can see the cathedral in the background, but the Christian 16th century cathedral, and that, of course, wasn't even built in the times of San Fernando, 13th century. And also all the people and nobles are dressed in sort of 17th century clothes, not the clothes they actually wore at the time of the Reconquest. Through the next room we walk through is the treasury. Córdoba is famous for silversmiths. There's a long tradition here of silver working, and these treasures date from the 13th century to the 19th century. There's an ivory crucifix. Okay, now we are back in the mosque itself. This is the third and last addition to the mosque. It's called the addition of Al-Mansur, late 10th century A.D. I'll try to briefly tell you about Al-Mansur. It's sort of a nickname which means the defeater, and he was that kind of guy. He wasn't actually a member of the Umayyad dynasty family. He was a counselor who was so ambitious and greedy for power that he managed to move up through the ranks and become the tutor of a young prince who was not old enough to rule. And basically, Al-Mansur took over as sort of a dictator, and he was a real military dictator. He expanded the territories of the Umayyad Empire, the Caliphate of Córdoba, further north than anyone, up into the Basque Country region, and he was the kind of ruler that imposed his law with an iron hand. He burned books. He would enslave captured soldiers and marry the princesses. He would pretty much do what he wanted, and he was determined to have the largest part of the mosque. But he knew he had to respect Al-Hakam's II's mihrab, which was unsurpassable in its beauty and magnificence. So he decided to build to the east. So it might be the largest part, but it's also the least artistically interesting. It doesn't have beautifully carved capitals. It doesn't have alternating colors of different types of marble in the columns. It's all quite uniform. And even the double arches themselves are kind of phony. They're not stone and brick alternating red and white designs. They're stone and the red is actually just painted on. And you can see where some of the builders who worked here signed their signatures on the columns. Around the outside of the entire mosque, there's many chapels, and this is something we see in Christian churches. It's very common to see small chapels around the outside of the wall, around the outside of the walls, and these are small chapels dedicated to a person who might be buried there, an archbishop or a noble, and they contain artwork and altarpieces, but we don't have time to look at all of these. However, we are going to look at the cathedral. So the Cathedral of Córdoba is right smack dab in the middle of the mosque. It's been compared to a yolk in the white of an egg. In 1236, Ferdinand III reconquered Córdoba from the Muslims, and they converted the mosque into a Christian church, but they didn't actually remodel it or build anything there for a while. In the 15th century, they built the old cathedral, which we showed you, and now in the 16th century, they built the actual cathedral within the mosque. In fact, today they call it Cordoba's Cathedral Mosque. Of course, most people just call it the mosque, and the most interesting thing to visit here, of course, is the mosque. But we're going to take a look at the cathedral. They destroyed part of Abderrahman II's and Al-Mansour's mosque, and in 1523, they started the construction of the Cathedral of Córdoba. The first architect was Hernán Ruiz el Viejo, which means the old, sort of Hernán Ruiz Sr. And then his son took over, Hernán Ruiz II, very important architect who we'll see again in Seville. He's from Córdoba. And Hernán Ruiz's grandson, Hernán Ruiz III, finished off the work 100 years later. So it was started in sort of a transitional Gothic to Renaissance period by Hernán Ruiz el Viejo. His son, Hernán Ruiz II, was a real Renaissance architect. And the grandson is sort of a Mannerist architect who comes after Renaissance. Now, when they started this construction on the cathedral, Charles V, Carlos V, the Holy Roman Emperor, king of the Spanish Empire, he approved the construction of the cathedral, but when he came here to visit, he actually regretted what they had what they'd done, and his quote was, "We have destroyed what was unique in the world and put in its place what you can see anywhere." And he was so serious about not continuing the expansion of this cathedral and not destroying any more of the mosque that the legend is he put the death penalty on any workers who destroyed more of the mosque to complete the cathedral. So that pretty much stopped the expansion of the cathedral, but of course the work continued, and the cathedral was built up, but they no longer destroyed any more of the mosque. The main chapel of the cathedral is a Latin cross floor plan with a barrel vault. There's an ovaloid dome. That's by Juan de Ochoa. It's Mannerist style, almost Baroque. There's abundant ornamentation around the walls. plateresque ornamentation below. And as you look up, sort of pre-Baroque mannerism. The main altar is made from marble from Córdoba and red jasper. It's by architect and sculptor Matias Alonso. The choir walls by Hernan Ruiz II. There's magnificent mahogany choir seats. And there's 2 organs. Well, we're going to work our way to the exit now. We're going to go out now and check out the old town of Córdoba.
Okay, let's take a walk through the heart of the old Córdoba. It's called the Juderia. That means the Jewish quarters. And that was because after San Fernando conquered Córdoba in 1236, they made the neighborhood behind what was the mosque into the Jewish quarters. It was a walled neighborhood, and Jewish citizens lived there, and they had workshops and shops and stores and financing. And it was an important, vibrant part of the community of medieval Córdoba. It's actually sort of Islamic layout. And that means that the streets are very small and laid out in sort of a labyrinth. To keep the sun and the heat out, they weren't straight streets. They're narrow, small pedestrian streets. Let's go take a look. This is the Street of the Flowers, the Calle de las Flores. It's really one of the most picturesque and typical little bitty streets in the Juderia. It's actually a dead-end street. It has a little plaza at the end. It was once a patio de vecinos, which means it's where all the neighbors had little houses around a corral, around a courtyard. It was bought by City Hall and made into sort of a monumental plaza with this beautiful little fountain, and it's filled with flowers. And there's a spectacular view of the tower of the cathedral mosque at the end of the Calle de las Flores, the end of the Street of the Flowers. Okay, we're here in the Plaza Cardinal Salazar in front of the University of Córdoba. That's the Department of Language and Literature. And here's a statue, monument to one of the great doctors of medieval Córdoba. In the Umayyad times, Córdoba was the center of learning and science, and they produced some great philosophers and great mathematicians, astronomers, and doctors. This man, Al-Kafiqi, born in Andalusia, he went to Egypt to study, and he returned to Córdoba, and he was a great eye doctor. He wrote books on the treatment of ailments of the eye that were used for centuries. And here in Córdoba, they like to say that he invented glasses, he invented spectacles. That may not be true. There were other doctors later who might have invented, in Italy, the use of eyewear. But whatever the case is, in Spanish, the word for glasses is gafas, which comes from his name, Al-Kafiqi. So thanks to him, I can read my phone. This is a Mudéjar chapel of San Bartolome. Now, Mudéjar is a style in Christian times, 13th, 14th century, but the actual architects and artisans were Muslims. So it's sort of a fusion of Christian and Muslim architecture. This was a Catholic church, but it was built by Muslims in a sort of Muslim style. So as we wander through the Juderia, we come here to the Zoco Municipal. Zoco is an Arabic word that means marketplace, and it's essentially the municipal marketplace of artisania. Now, in the 1950s, there were 31 impoverished families living here, and City Hall paid them off and bought them out, and they restored this area and made it the first marketplace of artisania in Europe. It's sort of a museum and a tourist attraction. It's an interior courtyard with fountains, and there's artisania shops all the way around. They make things like leather goods and silversmithing. Silversmithing is an important artisania here in Córdoba. And you can shop here. Right now it's closed up, but when things open up after the pandemic, this will be quite a place to visit and buy souvenirs and check out the artisania. This is next to the Zoco Municipal. It was part of the same large building. In the 1950s, it was bought out and made into a museum of bullfighting. And in Cordoba, there's a great tradition of famous bullfighters. There's Rafael Molina, El Lagartijo, Rafael Guerrera, El Guerrita, and of course there's El Cordobés. There's El Cordobés, the father, and then his unrecognized illegitimate son, El Cordobés Benito Diaz, who's still alive today. They're all from Cordoba. There's just a great tradition of bullfighting here. It's part of the local culture and local history. This is the monument to Maimonides. Maimonides was a Jewish scholar. He was a Jewish scholar in medieval times, and he was a doctor, a philosopher, and a rabbi. He rejected poetry. He was more interested in science and medicine. He worked in Cordoba, Morocco, and Egypt. When the Almohads conquered Al-Andalus in the 12th century, privileges for non-Muslims were suspended, and he was forced to convert or leave. He chose exile. He might even have pretended to be a convert long enough to flee Al-Andalus. He lived in Fez, which is today in Morocco, and he left for Jerusalem. He wound up in Egypt. He classified himself as a Sephardic Jew of Spanish origin. His brother died in a sea journey to India, making him so sad he became very, very sick. He was said to be descended from King David. He was a great doctor, an expert in asthma, diabetes, hepatitis, and pneumonia. He wrote texts which were used for centuries. He was even the great Sultan Saladin's doctor. He would work in the court of Saladin all day, returning home exhausted, only to find his home full of patients, which he would work on curing until late into the night. He died in Cairo, and his son became a great doctor too. Local tradition has it that if you rub the shoe, some of his knowledge might rub off on you. This is the synagogue of Cordoba. It's no longer used as a synagogue. It's a monument now, but it was a synagogue. It's actually Mudéjar style. The Jewish inhabitants of the Juderia were artisans and shop owners and investors. but they didn't have an architectural style or a building style. They employed Muslims to do the building, so the style of architecture is mudéjar. This is one of the three finest synagogues that still exists in Spain, behind the Tránsito and Santa María de la Blanca synagogues in Toledo. So after the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 by Queen Isabel, this became a hospital for rabies, and then later it was a hermitage and a shoemaker's guild, and it finally became the school of San Crespin. In 1884, Rafael Romero Barros, Julio Romero de Torres' father, was restoring this, and he found inscriptions in Hebrew, which led to the posterior restoration of the synagogue. In 1985, it opened as a monument of World Heritage, marking the 850th year anniversary of the birth of Maimonides. There's a gallery upstairs for the women. There's 3 balconies with multifoil arches. There's a prayer hall, which is almost square, with a ceiling of over 6 meters high. The west side has a tabernacle space reserved for the Torah, text of law, and there's big multifoil arches with lattice work where the altar was. Mudéjar plasterwork has been lost up to 2 meters. There's not many inscriptions left. Around the door, we see fragments of Proverbs, Solomon 122, and there's a few inscriptions on the east and west walls. Okay, this is the Puerta de Almovedar, the gateway to Almovedar. Almovedar is a nice town about 23 kilometers from here, and this great big castle there. This is one of 3 existing gateways in the old wall which wrapped around the heart of Córdoba. It was, what we see here is a 14th century reformation of an existing Bab Islamic doorway from before the 10th century. This is the street Kairouan. It's named after the sister city of Córdoba, which is located in Tunisia and in Tunis, and it was once a Jewish cemetery for the Juderia, and now it's sort of a promenade, a nice walkway next to the old city walls. It has a stream here, which they've made into these nice sort of stone pools. This is Seneca, 1st century AD Roman philosopher, one of the great Roman philosophers. He was born here in Córdoba. His philosophy was Stoicism. He was a Stoic. His philosophy was to just tough it up, to be Stoic, to just suffer things like poverty and hardships. But they might have accused him of being a hypocrite because he's actually one of the wealthiest men in the Roman Empire. He had enemies in high places. His own student, Nero, turned against him and led to his demise. I mean, bear in mind, Nero killed his own mom, so he's not the kind of person you want on your enemy list. Seneca believed that life was long enough if you took advantage of every moment. If you seized every moment, life was long enough. And his life apparently was long enough because he ended it himself by slitting his wrists in a hot bathtub rather than face the wrath of Emperor Nero. Here's yet another doctor, philosopher from the golden age of Córdoba, from the Islamic times, Averroes. He was a mathematician and a medical doctor. Well, I sure hope you've enjoyed the trip to Cordoba. It's time to go back to Seville now. We're going to walk from the center of the Juderia over to the train station and make our way back to Seville. It's a beautiful historic city. It's really a very typical Spanish city with the Islamic influence and the short buildings, the whitewashed walls and red ceramic roof tiles, the little balconies, the courtyards with fountains and wells. It's a magical place. It's a place of artisania and art, and flamenco music, bullfighting, all of those things we think about when we think of Spain. So, once again, I hope you enjoyed our visit to Cordoba. Let's head back to Seville.